When we think of God, it's almost inevitable that a picture of an all-supreme, absolute, and incomprehensible being forms in our minds. The idea of a God who is omnipotent and omnipresent, who can do anything and is everywhere, challenges our understanding of the limits of our own reality. But is there a limit to God? Or is it possible that in his majesty and infinity, he transcends all human notions of limits? This is the first mystery we must unravel: the definition of omnipotence and omnipresence. Let's begin with omnipotence. Omnipotent means all-powerful. But does this really mean that God can do anything, even things that are logically impossible? In its simplest form, omnipotence is the ability to do anything that is logically possible. Here arises the first dilemma. Can logic itself be a limit? Can God create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it? The very question about the relationship between logic and divine power reveals an intriguing hook. Is God truly all-powerful, or are we talking about a power within certain parameters defined by his own nature? Now, let's move a step further. Omnipresence is the second fundamental attribute of God. God is everywhere, at all times, simultaneously. His presence is incomprehensible to the limited human mind. If God is everywhere at the same time, does that mean he can see, hear, and feel everything that happens in our lives at every moment? But how can we understand this without falling into a sense of helplessness before his divine grandeur? How would it feel to live in a world where you know that God is not just within you, but within every atom, every second? Here arises the second mysterious hook. Does God's omnipresence truly limit our choices, or does he allow our freedom despite his constant presence? These two foundational concepts, omnipotence and omnipresence, have been the focus of the greatest theological and philosophical debates throughout the centuries. But what truly fascinates us is that even with these supreme qualities, there seems to be something in God that is beyond any human understanding. How can we accept that? Being all-powerful and everywhere, he still grants us the freedom to act. How can we reconcile the idea of a God who can do everything, yet does not choose to control everything? This is the real question. If God is omnipotent and omnipresent, what are the limits of his action in the world? This reflection leads us to a perspective that, at first glance, appears contradictory. God's omnipotence doesn't mean he does everything, but rather that he chooses not to do everything. He chooses not to constantly manipulate our actions because he desires that we exercise free will. And at this point, we encounter a new mystery. Are the limits of God, in fact, a manifestation of his greatest greatness and love? God could, in his omnipotence, force our obedience, our morality, our faith, but he chooses not to do so. This opens up a new discussion. God, by being omnipotent, has the power to choose not to exercise all his power. But what does this mean for the concept of omnipotence? Let yourself be drawn into this enigma. The mystery lies not only in the power God possesses, but in the choices he makes with that power. True omnipotence, then, is not about doing everything, but about choosing what to do, and most importantly, what not to do. And that is the secret waiting for those who seek to understand the limits and nature of the divine. These mysteries invite us to think beyond the limits of human reasoning, where the search for answers becomes a fascinating yet challenging journey. God is more than the attributes we know. He is the invisible force that shapes the universe, but also the silence that allows us to live in freedom. If the limits of God are a reflection of his choice, what does this say about us beings created in his image and likeness? As we move deeper into understanding the nature of God's omnipotence, we encounter an age-old paradox that challenges both the mind and spirit. Can God do the impossible? It's a question that has sparked countless debates among theologians, philosophers, and lay people alike. On one hand, if God is truly omnipotent, it would seem to imply that he can do absolutely anything, no limitations, no boundaries. But on the other hand, we are faced with logical paradoxes that seem to push the very definition of omnipotence into a realm that may not be coherent with the nature of divinity. One of the most famous formulations of this paradox is the question, can God create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it? At first glance, it seems absurd. If God is all-powerful, surely he should be able to do anything, including creating such a rock. But if God can't lift it, then there's something he cannot do, which contradicts his supposed omnipotence. However, if God can lift it, then that would suggest there's something he cannot create, which again seems to place a limit on his power. But here lies the first key to understanding the paradox. Is omnipotence about doing the logically impossible? Can God, in his omnipotence, perform tasks that are logically contradictory or self-defeating? To put it another way, can omnipotence extend to the realm of logical absurdities? The answer from many theologians and philosophers is no. Omnipotence, they argue, doesn't mean the power to do the logically impossible. Rather, it means the power to do anything that is logically possible. This subtle yet significant distinction helps us understand that God's omnipotence is not about having the ability to do everything. It's about having the ability to do anything that can be coherently conceived. A logically incoherent task, such as creating a rock so heavy that even God can't lift it, is not a genuine task at all. It's a logical contradiction, not a true possibility. This opens up a new perspective. God's omnipotence is not limited by the impossible, because the impossible is not even a real thing. But what does this tell us about God's nature? Here's the paradox within the paradox. The very fact that God cannot do the logically impossible is a reflection of his nature, not a limitation. God is a being of perfect logic, order, and coherence. His omnipotence is perfectly aligned with his rationality and goodness. The power to do the logically impossible would not make God more powerful, but less coherent. In fact, it would undermine the very nature of his omnipotence. A God who could create self-contradictions would not be all-powerful. He would be a God of confusion and chaos, incapable of true consistency. This leads us to an even deeper question. Why does God's omnipotence need to be tied to logic and reason? Couldn't God, in his infinite power, act outside of the realm of logic and reason? The key to understanding this, again, comes from the idea of God's intrinsic nature. God's omnipotence is not just about power. It is about his consistent nature as a being of absolute truth and order. In other words, God's omnipotence is not simply a brute force. It is a force that operates according to his perfect and unchanging nature. He cannot act in contradiction to his essence. This understanding provides a crucial shift in perspective. Rather than seeing the limits of omnipotence as weaknesses, we begin to recognize them as a reflection of God's perfect nature. Omnipotence is not just the power to do anything, but the power to do everything that is consistent with God's inherent nature of truth, order, and goodness. The paradox of omnipotence is not a flaw in God's power. It is a reflection of his transcendent consistency. Ultimately, this paradox teaches us something profoundly important about the nature of divine power. True omnipotence is not the power to do everything, but the power to do what is ultimately good and consistent with the divine nature. God's power, far from being undermined by the impossibility of logical contradictions, is made even more magnificent by the fact that his omnipotence is guided by his perfect nature. So, while the question of whether God can do the impossible may seem like an unsolvable riddle, it actually invites us into a deeper understanding of divine omnipotence. It leads us to consider that the true essence of power is not the ability to transcend logic, but the ability to perfectly align with a higher, unshakable truth. In this way, God's omnipotence is not diminished by limits, it is magnified by them. As we consider the vastness of God's omnipresence, we must confront another pressing question. Does God's constant presence in all things, at all times, limit human free will? This is a question that not only challenges our understanding of God's nature, but also the very concept of human autonomy and responsibility. How can we truly be free if God is everywhere, witnessing every action, every thought, and every decision we make? Omnipresence, by definition, means that God is present everywhere, all the time. There is no place where he is not. The magnitude of this attribute can feel overwhelming. Imagine a world in which every action, every word, every feeling is constantly under the watchful eye of an all-knowing, ever-present God. With God's presence filling every corner of existence, can we really make free choices? Or are our actions predetermined, influenced, or even controlled by God's eternal gaze? At first glance, the idea that God's omnipresence might limit our freedom seems plausible. If God is present in every moment, can we still exercise true autonomy? Does the knowledge that God is always watching affect our decisions? And if so, does that mean we're not truly free? Is free will compatible with omnipresence? This is the third great mystery that we must explore. The traditional Christian perspective holds that human free will and divine omnipresence can coexist. The key to reconciling these two attributes lies in understanding the nature of God's presence. While God is everywhere, his presence does not force or control our decisions. Rather, his omnipresence is a constant reminder that though we are free to choose, we are never outside of his loving, guiding presence. In other words, God's omnipresence doesn't negate our freedom. Instead, it invites us into a deeper relationship with him. The presence of God in all things is not a constant compulsion, but a constant opportunity, a chance to align our wills with his divine purpose. God, in his omnipresence, is always near, offering guidance, support, and the freedom to choose how we respond to his presence. But even within this framework, we must ask, does omnipresence create a paradox where God is so near that we cannot truly act freely? The answer comes when we understand that the presence of God is not about forceful intervention in our decisions, but rather about offering a space for us to make those choices with knowledge, love, and truth. It is the freedom to choose in the context of divine presence that makes our decisions meaningful. True freedom is not about being able to act without any influence, but about being able to make choices in accordance with our deepest understanding of right and wrong, good and evil, and ultimately in alignment with the loving will of God. This leads to a further exploration of what it means to be free. Is freedom simply the absence of constraints, or is it the capacity to make choices in the presence of a greater truth? The freedom we speak of in human terms is not about escaping God's presence or avoiding his influence. It is about the ability to choose how we engage with that presence. True freedom, therefore, lies in choosing whether to accept or reject the divine invitation to live in harmony with the Creator. Furthermore, God's omnipresence brings with it an important aspect of divine love and justice. While God is always present, he does not force us into compliance or make us robots of divine will. Instead, he gives us the dignity of choice, the ability to shape our paths. This is the divine paradox. God is everywhere, yet he allows us to be truly free. His omnipresence does not impose limitations on our freedom, but offers an ever-present source of support, wisdom, and love to guide our decisions. This brings us to an essential point. God's presence is not a burden, but a blessing. It is through his omnipresence that we are given the opportunity to choose, grow, and experience life in its fullest. The very fact that God is with us always gives us the freedom to explore, to stumble, to learn, and to rise. It allows us to be fully human, to make real choices that matter. And yet, in this freedom, there is a deeper mystery. Does the knowledge of God's omnipresence actually influence our choices? When we are aware that God is always near, does it encourage us to act with more integrity and responsibility? Could it be that the presence of God, rather than limiting our choices, actually enhances our ability to choose wisely? The divine nearness offers us a sense of accountability and purpose, inspiring us to live lives that reflect the truth and love we know to be at the heart of our existence. As we reflect on the relationship between omnipresence and free will, we realize that the very nature of God's presence is not one of coercion or control, but of invitation and freedom. God is present, but he is not imposing. He is near, but he is not overbearing. His omnipresence provides us with the ability to make true, meaningful choices, and it is in these choices that we find our true freedom. As we explore the limits of God's omnipotence, we inevitably arrive at one of the most profound questions that has perplexed humanity for centuries. If God is all-powerful, why does he allow suffering and evil in the world? This is the classic problem of evil, and it strikes at the heart of theological inquiry, challenging both the nature of God and the very meaning of existence. How can an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God permit the pain, injustice, and evil that we witness in the world? The presence of suffering, especially when it seems senseless or excessive, appears to stand in direct contradiction to the concept of a loving, all-powerful creator. To begin to answer this question, we first must examine the core of God's omnipotence. Is it possible that God's power has limits in some way that makes evil and suffering inevitable? Or could it be that God's omnipotence doesn't necessarily mean control over every aspect of the universe, including the free actions of creatures capable of choosing evil? Here we come across a crucial distinction. God's omnipotence might not be about controlling every detail of reality, but rather about allowing creation the freedom to act within the bounds of his greater plan. At the heart of the problem of evil lies the issue of free will. If God is truly omnipotent, why doesn't he simply eliminate evil and suffering? Why would a perfectly good, all-powerful God create a world where suffering is allowed to exist? The answer lies in the fact that true love and goodness cannot exist without free will. A universe where creatures have the ability to choose, both good and evil, is a world in which genuine love and morality are possible. If God were to remove the possibility of evil entirely, he would also remove the possibility of real love, compassion, and virtue. Without the freedom to choose, human beings would be no more than puppets, their actions predetermined by God, leaving no room for authentic relationship with the Creator. Therefore, it could be argued that God's omnipotence does not entail the elimination of free will, but rather its allowance and preservation. In a world where free will exists, there will inevitably be instances where that freedom is misused, leading to suffering and evil. God's omnipotence is not exercised in micromanaging every human action, but rather in creating a universe where the possibility of love, goodness, and righteousness can flourish, despite the inevitable presence of suffering caused by free will. But if God allows suffering through free will, does that mean he is indifferent to the pain of his creatures? Does his omnipotence imply a lack of concern or action when his creation is hurting? The answer to this question is, of course, no. While God allows the possibility of suffering, his omnipotence also means he is actively involved in responding to and alleviating that suffering. The Christian understanding of God's omnipotence includes the belief that God is not distant or detached from the pain of the world, but rather enters into it. This is most poignantly seen in the figure of Jesus Christ, who, as God incarnate, willingly embraced suffering and death on the cross. By taking on human suffering, God demonstrated his immense power, not in eliminating pain from the world, but in redeeming it. This leads us to an even deeper theological consideration. God's omnipotence might be seen more clearly in the way he transforms suffering, rather than in preventing it entirely. While we may not be able to fully comprehend why God allows suffering, we can see how he uses it to bring about a greater good. The existence of suffering, as painful as it is allows for the possibility of redemption, transformation, and the growth of virtues like patience, empathy, and compassion. God's power is not in eradicating suffering, but in using it as a means to bring about a deeper understanding of life and a greater connection with Him. In this way, God's omnipotence is not defined by the removal of all pain and evil, but by His ability to bring good from all circumstances. The Apostle Paul, in the New Testament, writes that, "In all things God works for the good of those who love Him." Romans 8:28. This suggests that God's omnipotence is not exercised in a world of perfection without suffering, but in a world where even suffering has the potential to serve a higher purpose. This leads to the idea that God allows evil and suffering not because He is powerless to stop it, but because He is working within a larger framework of divine love and redemption. God's omnipotence, in this sense, is more aligned with the long-term goal of bringing about ultimate good rather than short-term, immediate perfection. The existence of evil does not negate God's power. Rather, it presents a profound paradox in which God's ultimate power is demonstrated not through the absence of suffering, but through His ability to bring light out of darkness and hope out of despair. In this light, we begin to understand that God's omnipotence is not a guarantee of a world without suffering, but a promise that suffering will not have the last word. God's omnipotence ensures that, in the end, all things will be made right, that evil will be overcome, and that suffering will give way to ultimate healing and redemption. As we delve deeper into the enigma of omnipotence, we must address one of the most intriguing aspects of God's power: the nature of miracles. If God is truly omnipotent, does this mean that He can do absolutely anything, even the seemingly impossible? What exactly are the limits of divine power when it comes to supernatural acts like miracles, and how do they fit into our understanding of God's omnipotence? A miracle, by definition, is an event or action that defies the laws of nature and human understanding. These occurrences, often considered divine interventions, seem to be moments when the natural order of the world is suspended or altered by the hand of God. From the parting of the Red Sea to the resurrection of Jesus, the Bible is filled with examples of miraculous acts that showcase God's limitless power. But while these miracles are awe-inspiring and undeniably point to God's omnipotence, they also raise the question, can God truly do anything, even what seems logically or physically impossible? In answering this question, we must first consider the nature of God's omnipotence. While it is commonly understood that omnipotence means the ability to do anything, it's essential to recognize that God's omnipotence operates within the bounds of His own nature. This is an important distinction. God cannot do anything that contradicts His inherent qualities. For example, He cannot act in a way that would deny His own goodness, justice, or truth. This raises a critical point. Omnipotence does not mean the ability to perform logical contradictions. God cannot make a square circle, for instance, because this is not a matter of power, but of logical impossibility. So, when it comes to miracles, the question shifts slightly. Does the concept of a miracle represent an exception to the laws of nature, or is it simply God working in ways beyond our understanding of nature? If God is omnipotent, then He is certainly capable of intervening in the natural world and performing miracles. However, these miracles are not violations of logic or reality. Rather, they represent God's sovereignty over the natural order. Miracles demonstrate God's power to shape, bend, and alter the fabric of creation according to His will, while still remaining consistent with His divine nature. This leads us to an interesting paradox. Miracles are not a suspension of reality, but a demonstration of God's ultimate authority over it. When God performs a miracle, He is not defying the rules of the universe in an arbitrary way. Rather, He is showing that He, as the Creator, holds ultimate authority over those rules. The laws of nature are not inherently above God, they are His creation. Therefore, when he acts outside of those laws, he is simply exercising his divine prerogative to shape creation as he sees fit. For example, in the New Testament, when Jesus heals the sick, raises the dead, or calms storms, he is not breaking the world's natural laws. He is revealing that he is the one who made them. In this sense, miracles are not acts of defiance against creation, but rather acts of divine revelation. They are moments when God's power and authority shine through in ways that we can perceive and understand. They point to a reality beyond our natural understanding, one in which the Creator has the power to reshape the world as he desires, without violating the fundamental truths of existence. Another crucial aspect of God's omnipotence in relation to miracles is the fact that miracles always serve a higher purpose. They are not mere demonstrations of raw power, but acts of grace, love, and redemption. Whether it's healing a sick person or raising someone from the dead, the miracles of God are always aimed at fulfilling his divine plan for humanity. This is a key point. God's omnipotence is never arbitrary. It is always directed towards the good of his creation and the fulfillment of his will. Miracles, therefore, are not random displays of power, but carefully orchestrated acts that reveal God's love, compassion, and desire to restore his creation. In this context, miracles are also not meant to be seen as a sign of weakness or inability on God's part. God does not need to perform miracles to prove his omnipotence. He is omnipotent by nature, regardless of whether or not he intervenes in the world. Miracles are not necessary for God to demonstrate his power. They are simply a means by which he shows his care for his creation and reveals his ultimate authority. Moreover, miracles serve as a sign of hope for humanity. In a world marred by suffering and sin, they offer glimpses of a reality where God's perfect will is accomplished and where his power is used to restore, heal, and renew. In the act of performing miracles, God shows that he is actively engaged in the world and that he is working to bring about a better future, one in which his glory and goodness will ultimately prevail. Ultimately, miracles represent God's sovereign will being revealed in the world. They are not violations of natural law, but instead they show how God, in his omnipotence, works within and through creation to fulfill his divine purposes. Miracles remind us that the natural world is not the final authority. Rather, it is a reflection of the Creator's will. And when God chooses to reveal his power through miraculous acts, he does so to remind us of his sovereignty, his love, and his ultimate authority over all things. Therefore, the omnipotence of God is not limited by the impossibility of miracles, but rather, miracles demonstrate the divine power that exists beyond human comprehension. They are a testimony to the fact that God is not bound by human limitations or the rules of nature, but rather, he is the ultimate authority, capable of shaping the world according to his will. One of the most profound aspects of God's omnipotence is the question of his timelessness. Does God's omnipotence change over time, or is it a constant, unchanging force that exists outside of time itself? This topic takes us into the realm of both philosophy and theology, as we grapple with the nature of eternity and God's interaction with the timeline of creation. To begin, it's crucial to understand that God's omnipotence is not like human power, which is often bound by time and circumstance. Human beings operate within the constraints of time. We grow older, lose energy, and our strength can fluctuate with the passage of time. However, God's omnipotence is not subject to these limitations. God exists outside the realm of time as an eternal being who is not confined to the past, present, or future. This means that God's power is not something that increases or diminishes over time, but remains constant. In the Christian tradition, it is taught that God is immutable, which means that he is unchanging in his nature, purpose, and character. His omnipotence is part of that unchangeable nature. From the beginning of creation to the end of time, God's power remains perfectly the same, transcending the limitations of time and space. His omnipotence is eternal and infinite. As the Bible says in Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. This verse underscores the idea that God, and by extension his omnipotence, is not subject to the passage of time. But how does this eternal, unchanging nature of God's power relate to his actions within time? Here, we encounter a fascinating tension. God's omnipotence is not altered by time, yet he interacts with time in a dynamic way. While God himself is beyond time, he chooses to interact with the world he created, which exists in time. This is seen most clearly in the life of Jesus Christ, who, though fully divine, entered into the world of time and space as a human being. The incarnation of Christ is a powerful example of how God's eternal nature engages with the temporal world. Yet, the question still remains, does God's omnipotence change in how it manifests over time, or does it remain constant, no matter the era? The answer is complex. While God's ability to act in the world is not limited by time, the way he exercises that power can change in accordance with his divine plan. For example, during the time of the Old Testament, God's omnipotence was demonstrated through acts like parting the Red Sea or bringing down fire from heaven. However, in the New Testament, the omnipotence of God is displayed through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, culminating in the ultimate act of redemption. This suggests that while God's power remains the same, his choices regarding how and when to exercise that power are influenced by his eternal plan. He works through history to bring about his ultimate purpose, and this plan unfolds in different stages over time. God's power is not less or more at different points in history, but his revelation of that power is sometimes more apparent and other times more hidden, depending on what he is accomplishing in his creation at that moment. Additionally, it's important to remember that God's omnipotence is not a simple display of raw force. It is always aligned with his perfect wisdom and love. Just because God has infinite power does not mean that he uses it indiscriminately or impulsively. His actions in time are perfectly consistent with his nature. For example, God's decision to allow the human race to exercise free will, even when that leads to suffering and evil, is part of his eternal wisdom and plan. His omnipotence is never exercised in contradiction to his goodness or justice, but rather in a way that brings about his perfect will in history. This leads us to another consideration. How does God's omnipotence relate to human history and human free will? If God is omnipotent, can we still make choices freely? Or are our actions simply the outworking of his divine will? The answer to this question is again rooted in the nature of God's omnipotence. While God is in control of all things, he has chosen to create a world where human beings are free to make choices. This is not a contradiction to his omnipotence. Rather, it is a testament to the depth and mystery of his power. God's ability to allow human freedom and still accomplish his will demonstrates that his power is not bound by time, but rather it is so great that it can work within the framework of time and human decisions to bring about his eternal purposes. In this sense, God's omnipotence transcends time while still interacting with it, allowing for the free will of his creatures while still ensuring that his ultimate plan for creation will be fulfilled. Finally, God's omnipotence does not depend on time, but is instead part of his nature as an eternal, self-sufficient being. His power is not like human power that wanes or grows stronger with the passage of time. Rather, it is a constant, unchanging force that is always available and always perfectly exercised according to his will. While time and history may unfold in stages, God's omnipotence remains the same, moving through time in ways that are perfect and purposeful.